The Tree of Life, Season 1, Chapter 7. In this episode, we will be talking about how supply chains could be reorganized along the lines set out in this podcast to reflect both reciprocal altruism and the telescopic effect. To start out, the effectiveness of globalization arises not out of the distribution of manufacture amongst non-linearly related individuals, but rather the segregation of individual processes to linearly related individuals. In other words, in an ideal system, the parts associated with a given supply chain would be segregated by family, whilst the top of the supply chain would be linearly related to all of them, or most of them. The idea would be that individual parts or components of the manufacturing process would be built or completed by individual unrelated families. At each level of the supply chain, the manager would be linearly related to all the unrelated families tasked with manufacture of the individual part in the process. This would take advantage of reciprocal altruism within families, as well as higher synchronicity between related levels through the telescopic effect. Essentially, what I am saying is, there would be two parts of the process. 1. Identification by lineal relation among workers. 2. Organization of the manufacturing task into segregated steps, assigned to individual families. The manager of each level of the manufacturing process would have the highest interrelation to all the families comprising the constituent parts of the process corresponding to that stage. This would enhance productivity through reciprocal altruism within each process, whilst also taking advantage of the telescopic effect linking the decision-making of lateral alters, or lineal relations, to optimize the outcome for the group. Now, of course, you couldn't arbitrarily organize the supply chain this way by role, but rather, recognizing the difficulty in identification of lateral alters, promote by merit, which will be both a manifestation of lineal synchronicity and the telescopic effect. In other words, build a tiered structure toward the manufacture of any item with segregated steps assigned to individual families, the manager of each level of the tier having a greater relation to all lower families than they do to each other, whilst the manager of the process as a whole should have the greatest lineal relation to all the families, or the corresponding managers sequentially down the tiered structure. Now, since lineal relations in most countries are regional, rather than bothering with genetic identification, simply use regional classifications above family assignments. That is to say, managers at each level should be from the same region as the families below assigned segregated steps in the manufacture process. But it would be helpful to identify genetic relationships amongst managers. The other information that could be used to produce the same effect would be genetic genealogy, following migratory patterns in pre-agricultural populations. In other words, by using migratory patterns to identify those who share the greatest interrelation in the population, you can identify the stock which might be used to identify managers. Since the constituent parts of the process need not be related, but the managers should be linearly related to all of them. That's the end of the podcast for today.